The first thing I heard when I stepped into the reunion hall at Seabrook Lodge in Bar Harbor was laughter. Not the warm kind that lifts the room, but the sharp kind that lands somewhere under your ribs. I had chosen the navy dress carefully. It was bold. It was dramatic. It was the kind of dress that lets you pass through a crowd without inviting commentary. I smoothed the fabric at my hips before pushing open the double doors, already bracing myself for the way my family tended to greet me. Aunt Cheryl spotted me first. "Well, look who it is," she called across the folding tables and lobster bibs. "The ugly one made it." The words were bright and cheerful, as if she were announcing dessert. A few cousins laughed automatically. Someone clinked a glass. It echoed the way it always had, like tradition. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the practiced half-smile arranging itself across my face. I nodded once, as if the joke belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. My mother, Pamela Keene, stood near the dessert table in a pale linen suit. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct it. She smiled with the same expression she used when someone complimented her garden. "Oh, you know how they are," she said lightly, patting my arm as I reached her. "They tease because they love." Love had always sounded a lot like humiliation in this family. My cousin Tessa waved her phone in the air. "Group photo. Everybody in. Nora, maybe stand in the back. You're taller than Chloe." I was taller than Chloe, but I stepped behind her anyway, positioning myself between two uncles so that my face would be half shadowed in the shot. It was a choreography I knew by heart: shift, soften, minimize. The camera flashed. Someone said, "Smile bigger, Nora," as if my mouth were the only thing wrong with the picture. That was when I noticed him. He stood near the registration table, apart from the noise. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark blazer, sleeves pushed back slightly, holding a clipboard he was looking at. His eyes were on me. Not in the way men sometimes look. Not appraising. Not amused. Studying. As I reached for my name tag, Nora Keene, printed in block letters, his expression changed. Something passed across his face that didn't belong to reunion small talk. Recognition. It was subtle. A tightening at the jaw. A pause too long to be accidental. For a moment, I wondered if I had lipstick on my teeth or something on my dress. I glanced down, self-conscious out of reflex. When I looked back up, he was still watching. I had no idea that inside the trunk of his rental car, parked beneath the pines, there was a cedar photo album with my face on the first page. I only knew that for the first time in my life, someone in that room was looking at me as if I were at the punchline. And that frightened me more than the joke ever had. My name is Nora Keene, and I grew up in a family that assigned roles like birthrights: pretty one, smart one, troublemaker, ugly one. If you've ever been teased until it felt permanent, tell me one word they used. It started with a mirror and a sentence spoken casually. In our house, beauty was just appreciated. It was rent. I was 7 the first time I remember understanding that my face was a problem. My mother, Pamela Keene, had taken me to Mariner's cut salon on Main Street in Bar Harbor. I asked for a bob like the girl in my class who wore bright barrettes and laughed without covering her mouth. The stylist cut my hair to short. It framed my jaw in a way my mother didn't like. When we got home, she stood behind me in the bathroom and turned my chin left, then right, examining me as if I were a project she hadn't meant to start. "It just makes your features stronger," she said finally. Stronger was praise. At dinner that night, my father, Mark Keene, glanced up from his plate and said, "Well, at least Chloe got the pretty bones." My sister Chloe preened without meaning to. She was 9 and already aware of her symmetry. "Mom says I have Grandma Lydia's cheekbones," she said proudly. I touched my own face and tried to understand what bone I had inherited that made people look away. By 10, it had become a family rhythm. At birthdays, relatives brought Chloe gloss kits from Seaside Beauty, supplying little purses with sequins that caught the light. I received notebooks, practical sweaters, sometimes cookbooks. Yuri the smart one, and Cheryl would say brightly as if it were compensation. At church picnics at street. Brendan's Episcopal when the women gathered near the lemonade table. Someone would eventually nudge someone else and say, "Poor Nora. She got Mark's chin." They would say it gently, like weather commentary. I learned to smile before they finished the sentence. The joke followed me like a surname. At 13, during a family barbecue, Uncle Dennis asked Chloe to stand next to him for a photo because she photographed well. I volunteered to hold the camera. It was easier that way. Being useful was safer than being seen. I set tables. I rinsed dishes. I watched younger cousins so the adults could drink wine on the deck. When someone needed a ride to the airport or help moving boxes, I was the reliable one. No one ever called that beautiful. Publicly, we were charming. My parents hosted fundraisers for the Mount Desert Community Center. Chloe competed in pageants. I tutored kids at the local library. Privately, I learned that if you laugh at the joke before it lands, it hurts less. What I didn't understand then was why my grandmother, Irene Scully, never joined in. At Christmas dinners, when Aunt Cheryl would toast to Chloe's face and Nora's brains, Grandma Irene would stay quiet. She would pass me the salt instead of the punchline. She would look at me over her glasses with an expression that felt like apology. I thought she was embarrassed for me. I didn't realize she was observing them. There's a difference between humiliation and humiliation that's recorded. I wouldn't understand that until much later, when she handed me an old hand mirror with a crack down the center and told me to look closely at what was real and what was reflected. But first, there was the day she stopped laughing entirely. Grandma Irene Scully's house at 3 streets from the harbor, where the shingles had gone silver from salt and time. The porch boards creaked in a way that sounded like memory. Inside, the air always carried a faint trace of cinnamon and sea. She didn't talk much at family dinners. She watched. I started spending Saturdays at her house when I was 12. It wasn't announced or arranged. I just showed up one afternoon with a library book and stayed. She didn't ask why. The first time she handed me the mirror, it came wrapped in a dish towel. It was small, oval-shaped, with a crack running through the silver backing, so that my reflection split slightly down the middle. "It's old," she said. "Like most truth." I held it up uncertainly. The crack distorted my left eye. "People will hand you their opinions like mirrors," she continued, wiping her hands on her apron. "Don't mistake them for yours." She never used the word ugly. Not once. She called me observant. She said I noticed things others missed. She said I had a steadiness that would carry me further than symmetry ever could. We baked molasses bread together in her narrow kitchen, the kind that darkens as it cools. She measured flour carefully, tapping the cup against the bowl. "Keep receipts," she told me once, sliding a grocery slip into a drawer. "Not because you're suspicious. Because memory fades." Paper docent. It sounded like advice about budgeting. I didn't realize it was about something else. When I left her house, I always felt taller. There was a cedar drawer in her living room sideboard that she kept locked. I noticed it the way I noticed everything quietly. Once, when she stepped out to answer the phone, I saw her slide a thin album back inside before turning the key. I didn't ask. I thought it held old wedding photos or letters from my grandfather. I didn't know that my own face was printed inside that album more than once. I didn't know she was collecting something. At 13, the label followed me beyond family dinners. It moved into school hallways and locker room whispers. At 14, someone wrote it on the inside of my yearbook. Grandma Irene never asked what happened. She asked how I responded. And that, more than anything, changed the shape of me. By 15, the word had stopped sounding playful. It had weight. I overheard my mother one afternoon through the open kitchen window. She was standing in the driveway with Mrs. Donnelly from next door, arms folded against her chest, speaking in that soft, confessional tone adults use when they want sympathy disguised as concern. I just worry about Nora, she said. She's not like Chloe. She'll never marry well. She's going to need help her whole life. I stood inside, frozen by the sink, a damp dish towel in my hands. The plates in the drying rack gleamed. I stared at my reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the lawn. Never marry well. Need help. It washed cruelty shouted across the table. It was quieter than that. It was prediction. Fate spoken as certainty. Chloe, meanwhile, moved through high school like a breeze through open doors. Boys offered to carry her books. Teachers lingered after class to tell her she had presents. She dated the captain of the lacrosse team sophomore year and someone from Mount Desert Academy junior year. At school, I became efficient. Invisible but excellent. I earned top grades in AP Literature and Economics. I joined the debate team. I volunteered at the local hospital on weekends. When acceptance letters came in senior year, mine were thick. At dinner, my father glanced at my scholarship offer from Bowdoin College and said, "Well, at least your brains will take you somewhere. At least." "Smart is all you have," Chloe said once, not unkindly. Just factually. There's a particular loneliness in being praised only for the part of you that compensates for what they believe you lack. It was around then that my cousin Brian posted a photo from the 4th of July barbecue. I was mid-laugh, eyes half closed, mouth uneven. The caption read, "Ugly King's sister strikes again." It gathered likes like driftwood gathers salt. My phone buzzed for hours. Friends from school sent private messages, some sympathetic, some joking. I turned it face down and stared at the ceiling. When your family agrees you're unattractive, you start treating love like something you can't afford. You become careful with hope. I began declining invitations to dances. I learned how to stand behind people in group photos without being asked. I avoided mirrors except when necessary. The cracked-hand mirror Grandma Irene gave me stayed in my drawer, wrapped in its dish towel. At 18, when I left for Boston University with a partial scholarship and a part-time job at Harbor Street Books, no one cried except Grandma Irene. "You'll build something steady," she said, hugging me longer than usual. I believed her. I didn't yet know how much distance I would need to build it. Boston did not care whether I was pretty. It cared whether I showed up on time, whether I met deadlines, whether I could explain a budget without flinching. I moved into a narrow apartment in Dorchester with chipped baseboards and a window that faced another building's brick wall. I found a job as a grants coordinator at Seaport Community Health Network, eventually becoming a grants manager by 26. My days were spent translating need into language funders understood. It felt strangely honest proof on paper, outcomes measured, receipts attached. No one there called me ugly. They called me thorough, steady, dependable. I learned how to say no without apologizing for it. I stopped answering calls from home that began with "You'll never guess what Chloe did." I limited visits to holidays and left early when jokes resurfaced. Distance was dramatic. It was practical. Through all of it, Grandma Irene called every Sunday at 5. "How's your savings?" she would ask after we discussed the weather. "I'm contributing to my 401k, I would say," smiling into the phone. "Good," she'd reply. "Que proceed." She sent me newspaper clippings about community leaders and articles about women who built quiet lives without spectacle. Once, she mailed me a photo of us baking molasses bread. Her handwriting on the back steady is not small. When she died, it was not sudden, but it was final in a way that left the air thinner. I drove back to Bar Harbor for the funeral. The house smelled the same salt and cinnamon, but without her presence. It felt like a museum of someone who had been paying attention. At the reception, my mother spoke at length about how devoted Irene had been to family unity. My father discussed property taxes. Chloe asked loudly whether the house would be sold. Grief, in our family, was quickly translated into logistics. I stood near the kitchen doorway and watched them calculate. The will reading took place the following morning at the office of Gardner, Pike Rowland LLP. I sat at the end of the long conference table, hands folded in my lap. Pamela dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Mark kept clearing his throat. Most of it was straightforward. And then the attorney paused. There is one additional instruction, he said. A conditional directive: deliver the album when Chess ready. No one else seemed to register the sentence. I did. I didn't yet know what album he meant. But I felt something shift, quiet and deliberate. 3 months later, the reunion invitation arrived in the mail. The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope, embossed with a gold anchor at the top, as if we were a family known for something sturdier than sarcasm. Annual Keen Scully Reunion, it read. Seabrook Lodge, Bar Harbor. My mother called that evening. It would mean a lot if you came, Pamela said. After everything with Mom, we need unity. Unity. The words sounded rehearsed. Chloe had organized it, apparently. There would be catered lobster rolls, a photographer, a slideshow of family memories. Cousins were flying in from New York and Connecticut. Social media had already begun counting down the days. I hesitated for a week. Part of me didn't want to walk back into a room where my name had been a punchline. But another part, the steadier part Irene had cultivated, didn't want to keep avoiding it either. Avoidance can look like peace until you realize it's fear wearing softer clothes. I packed carefully. I chose the navy dress I could move in without adjusting. Not bold, not apologetic, just neutral. I pressed it myself the night before and laid it across the bed, as if preparing for something ceremonial rather than social. On the drive due north, the ocean fog rolled in thick over Route 1. It swallowed the pine trees and blurred the coastline into suggestion rather than certainty. I slowed my car, headlights cutting narrow beams through the haze. The fog felt familiar. For years, I had moved through my family like that, visibility reduced, outlines uncertain, voices distorted. You learn to rely on instinct when clarity is scarce. As I crossed into Bar Harbor, my phone buzzed with group texts. Chloe reminding everyone about cocktail attire. Aunt Cheryl joking about family awards. Someone added a laughing emoji next to my name. I turned the phone face down. I didn't know then that someone else had received an invitation that week. Not a glossy card with an anchor. A quiet message. A reminder of a promise made years ago. Irene had prepared more than molasses bread and Sunday phone calls. When I parked outside Seabrook Lodge and stepped into the lobby, the fog clung to my coat like residue. And inside, the old Rolls were already waiting for me. He was still standing near the registration table when the photographer started arranging us into clusters. Up close, he looked older than I first thought, mid-40s, maybe dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, posture steady in a way that felt practiced. Not defensive. Not eager. Just deliberate. He waited until the laughter around me thinned. Miss Keene, he said, glancing at my name tag again. Nora Keene? His voice was low and even, not flirtatious, not uncertain. Yes. My name is Elliot Wainwright. He extended his hand. His grip was warm and brief, like he understood the choreography of introductions. I was asked to come here by Irene Scully. Years ago. If certain things happened. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though no one else appeared to notice. My grandmother? I asked. Yes. He didn't elaborate. He didn't smile the way people do when they're about to deliver something dramatic. He simply held my gaze as if confirming something he had already suspected. I don't want to disrupt your event, he said, but I would appreciate a few minutes somewhere quieter, if you're willing. Across the room, I could feel my mother watching. Pamela had that look tight around the mouth, calculating around the eyes. Chloe followed her gaze and smirked. Careful, Chloe called out lightly, loud enough for several relatives to hear. He might like ugly girls. There was a ripple of laughter. Predictable. Safe. Elliot didn't laugh. He turned his head slowly toward Chloe. His expression didn't harden, it clarified. That's not a joke, he said. The words didn't rise above the music playing near the bar, but they landed with weight. Silence gathered in small pockets around us. My aunt coughed into her drink. Someone adjusted a chair. If you've ever watched someone call cruelty humor, you know how fast a room turns when someone finally refuses to laugh. For a moment, I felt exposed in a different way, not as the target, but as the center of something unfamiliar. Protection. Chloe shrugged, pretending indifference. Relax. It's family. Elliot's eyes flicked back to me. Irene was clear, he said quietly. If the pattern continued, I was to speak to you directly. Not them. The pattern. I felt my pulse in my throat. What pattern? I asked. He hesitated just long enough to signal that the answer mattered. Your grandmother kept proof, he said. Proof of what? He didn't answer that. Instead, he nodded toward the glass doors leading to the deck overlooking Frenchman Bay. Would you step outside with me? Behind us, the reunion swelled back into laughter and clinking glasses, as if nothing had shifted. My mother began moving in our direction, her heels precise against the wooden floor. I had spent most of my life shrinking in rooms like this. Instead, I followed Elliot toward the doors. Outside, the ocean fog rolled in low and quiet, swallowing the edges of the deck. Whatever he was about to say, it didn't belong in a room where cruelty was called tradition. We stepped outside the lodge because the air inside had become too tight. The fog had thickened, rolling in from the harbor and softening the edges of the dock lights. Elliot Wainwright stood beside his rental car and opened the trunk with the quiet certainty of someone who had rehearsed this moment more than once. He lifted out a cedar photo album. I knew the smell before he even opened it. Cedar has a way of announcing itself sharp, warm, grounding. My hands went cold. He carried it to a bench near the edge of the parking lot and sat down, resting the album on his knees. For a moment, he didn't speak. He opened it carefully, as if the hinges mattered. The first photograph was of a woman holding a newborn wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. The woman had my nose, not the chin my father joked about, not the features my mother adjusted with her hands in bathroom mirrors. My nose. Her hair was dark and soft at the edges. She was looking down at the baby with an expression I had never seen directed at me, uncomplicated recognition. This is Lydia Wainwright, Elliot said quietly. My sister. He turned the page. There was another photo. Same woman. Same baby. And in the background, slightly out of focus, stood Grandma Irene. My breath left me slowly. She was your biological mother, Elliot continued. She died when you were 6 months old. Complications from an infection. It happened fast. He reached into the back sleeve of the album and pulled out a small plastic pouch. Inside was a hospital bracelet, faded but legible. Street. Agnes Women's Hospital. Infant Nora Wainwright. Date June 14. Wainwright. I stared at the name as if it might rearrange itself. Lydia was in a difficult situation, Elliot said. Her ex-partner was abusive. Irene arranged a private adoption through an attorney in Portland. Pamela and Mark agreed to take you under strict conditions, no contact from Lydia Essex, no public disclosure. The fog pressed in closer. They said they would love you as their own, he added. I thought about my mother's grimace in the Solon mirror. My father's dinner table jokes. They did, Elliot said carefully. For a while. But resentment has a way of resurfacing when people feel trapped by promises they didn't fully understand. He turned another page. There were notes in Irene's handwriting. Dates. Observations. Comment at Thanksgiving, strong chin. Photo removed from frame. Repeated labeling. My chest tightened. The jokes, Elliot said. They started when you were old enough to hear them. I pressed my palm against the page, over the image of Lydia's face. All those years I thought I had inherited something flawed. I had inherited something true. What I don't understand, I said slowly, is why she waited. Why tell me now? Elliot closed the album gently. She didn't wait, he said. She prepared. The wind shifted. He hadn't yet explained the rest. He hadn't told me what Irene tied to this album or why my parents would care. But I could feel it coming, the way pressure builds before a storm breaks. Truth, I was learning, was only the first layer. Accountability was next. Elliot didn't close the album. He slid it slightly aside and reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. But he pulled out was sentimental. It was handwritten. It was precise. I-document stamped with the letterhead of Harbor Point Trust Services. My sister trusted Irene, he said quietly, and Irene trusted paperwork. He unfolded the pages and handed them to me. The paper was heavier than ordinary copy stock, cream-colored with a raised seal in the corner. Irene established a discretionary trust 15 years ago, Elliot continued, funded by her property holdings in a private investment account. You are the primary beneficiary. The words landed softly, almost gently. There are conditions, he added. Of course there were. The first condition, he said, pointing to a paragraph halfway down the page, requires confirmation that you have been informed of your biological parentage in full. My thumb hovered over the line. Informed. The second condition, he went on, requires confirmation that you are no longer financially or legally dependent on Pamela and Marquine. A small, almost bitter smile touched my mouth. That one's easy, I said. Elliot didn't smile back. The third condition, he said carefully, states that if Pamela and Mark attempt to obstruct disclosure of the truth or retaliate against you for receiving it, their remaining share of Irene's estate is forfeited. The fog seemed to thin just enough for the harbor lights to sharpen. They receive nothing, I asked. Nothing, Elliot confirmed. I stared at the final page. Attached to the trust were appendices. Copies of Irene's handwritten journals, dated entries documenting the ugly remarks. Transcriptions of voicemail messages left by my mother, Nora, has always been difficult looking saved and printed. Screenshots of the social media post my cousin had made, preserved with timestamps. Irene had archived my humiliation like evidence in a case file. She didn't just comfort you, Elliot said. She anticipated this. A strange warmth spread through my chest, not triumph, not revenge. Something steadier. She had believed me when I was too young to defend myself. She didn't want you dependent on people who reshaped your identity to suit their insecurities, he continued. So she built a structure that didn't require their permission. I thought about the cracked mirror, the advice about receipts, the way she never laughed. Why now? I asked again. Elliot met my eyes. Because the clause triggers today, he said, upon disclosure at a family gathering with a witness present. The reunion. The phone. The room full of relatives who had repeated the joke until it hardened into biography. My parents don't know, I asked. They believe they're attending a reunion, Elliot said calmly. They're not expecting an accounting. For years, I had felt small in rooms filled with my own family. Now, for the first time, I felt measured. There is a difference. I folded the trust documents, carefully unhanded the album back to him. Let's go inside, I said, because truth is private until it's ready, and then it belongs in the room. When I walked back into the reunion hall beside Elliot Wainwright, the room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. The lobster bibs, the folding tables, the framed family photos projected on the far wall, they all looked slightly misaligned, as if the space had shifted without telling anyone. My mother noticed first. Pamela's smile arrived too quickly, stretching across her face before it reached her eyes. There you are, she said, glancing at Elliot as though he were an inconvenience. We were about to start the slideshow. My father stood near the drinks table, hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't lifted. When his eyes met Elliot's, something in his posture changed. Not dramatic, just stiff. Chloe stepped forward. laughing lightly. Oh, good. You found your friend. We were just talking about old pictures. Pictures? Yes, I said calmly. So was I. Elliot inclined his head politely. Mr. and Mrs. Keen, he said. May we speak privately? Pamela S. smile tightened. If there's something to say, it can be said here. We're family. The word landed between us like an invitation and a warning. I felt the fog lift inside me, not all at once but steadily. I know who my mother was, I said. The room did not gasp. It stalled. The hum of conversation from the far tables faded into something hollow. Even the projector seemed to pause mid-transition between photographs. Mark's fingers tightened around his glass. The ice inside clinked sharply. What are you talking about? Pamela asked too quickly. Elliot spoke gently, not accusatory. Lydia Wainwright. My father's hands began to tremble. It was a theatrical shaking. It was small, involuntary. A tremor that moved from his knuckles to his wrist as if memory had weight. Chloe blinked. Who? Pamela turned toward Elliot. This is inappropriate, she said sharply. My mother had a tendency toward drama in her later years. My grandmother had a tendency toward documentation, I replied. That was when the room truly changed shape. Elliot placed the cedar album on the nearest table. The wood made a quiet sound against the laminate surface. He opened it deliberately, not rushing, turning to the first photograph. Lydia holding a baby. My face. Someone inhaled sharply. Pamela shook her head. Irene always resented us. She twisted things. Elliot removed the trust letter from his folder, the letterhead of Gardner, Pike Rolandell LP visible at the top. The trust conditions were drafted 15 years ago, he said evenly, well before any alleged resentment. He laid out copies of Irene's journal entries, the transcripts of voicemail messages, the printed screenshot of the ugly Keen sister post with its timestamp preserved. There was no shouting, just paper, dates, names. You agreed to adopt her under specific conditions, Elliot continued, and then you allowed ridicule to become routine. Pamela's voice sharpened. We gave her everything. I looked at her then not as a daughter bracing for impact, but as a woman examining evidence. Why? I asked quietly. Did you need me to believe I was ugly? Silence filled the space where laughter used to live. Chloe shifted her weight. I cousin coughed. The slideshow behind us flickered to an image of Chloe at 16, crown tilted on her head. Mark's hands were still shaking. Not because he had been exposed, but because he had been remembered. There is a difference between humiliation and accountability. One thrives in noise. The other survives on record. Pamela opened her mouth, then closed it. The room, once buoyed by jokes and wine, felt anchored. For the first time in my life, I was not the smallest presence in it. And the truth quiet, documented, patient was standing beside me. The reunion did not explode. It fractured. Clusters formed around folding tables and buffet trays, voices lowered but urgent. Aunt Cheryl pulled Pamela aside, whispering fiercely. Two cousins approached me quietly, offering apologies they had never considered necessary before. We thought it was just teasing, one of them said, eyes downcast. Chloe did not whisper. You just had to make this about you, she snapped, her voice carrying across the room. You couldn't let one event happen without ruining it. Ruining it. The word hung between us like a familiar accusation trying to find a new shape. I didn't ruin anything, I said calmly. I clarified it. Pamela stepped forward, her expression strained. After everything we did for you, she began, her tone shifting into something almost maternal. We raised you. We gave you opportunities. You gave me a role, I replied. Not a childhood. She opened her mouth again, but the old script had lost its authority. It sounded rehearsed now, hollow in a room that had just witnessed documentation. Relatives avoided eye contact. A few watched openly as if recalibrated their understanding of us. I walked to the table where Elliot had placed the cedar album and closed it carefully. I slid the trust letter back into its folder. My hands did not shake. There was nothing left to defend. Elliot met my eyes as I approached the door. "I'll be in town for a few days," he said quietly. "If you need anything." It wasn't pressure. It was presence. Outside, the fog had thinned to a pale mist. The harbor lights were steady now. My phone buzzed twice before I reached my car. Chloe. Then Tamala. I silenced them both. Later that night, I blocked the numbers that only ever called to correct me, diminish me, or summon me back into a version of myself I no longer recognized. Some families only miss you when they lose access to you. As I drove away from Seabrook Lodge, I didn't feel victorious. I felt unburdened. The album rested on the passenger seat beside me, cedar scent rising faintly with each turn. There was one place left to go, and this time I would arrive without shrinking. Irina's house looked smaller without her car in the driveway. The fog that had hovered over the harbor earlier that evening began to lift as I unlocked the front door. The air inside was cool, touched faintly by salt and cedar. For a moment, I stood in the entryway and listened. Houses hold silence differently when the person who anchored them is gone. I went straight to the kitchen. The cedar album rested on the table. I placed my hand on its cover as if it were warm. Then I opened the sideboard drawer where Irene kept her dish towels and recipe cards. The cracked mirror lay wrapped in the same faded cloth. I unwrapped it slowly. The crack still split my reflection in two, a thin line running from the top edge to the bottom. For years I had looked into it and tried to reconcile the version of myself others described with the face staring back at me. Tonight, I saw something else. I didn't throw it away. Instead, I carried it to the sink and cleaned the glass carefully, wiping away fingerprints and dust. The crack remained, but the surface around it gleamed. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a simple mirror from Harbor Street Home Goods. Nothing ornate, just clear glass in a wooden frame. I placed the new mirror beside the old one on the dresser in Irene's bedroom. Side by side, one cracked, one whole, both reflecting the same woman. At the kitchen table, I opened the cedar album and turned to the inside cover. With a steady hand, I wrote my name beneath Irene's careful script. Nora Lydia Wainwright. The ink dried slowly. I moved through the kitchen the way Irene had taught me, measuring flour, warming molasses, letting the yeast bloom. As the bread baked, the house filled with that dark, steady sweetness that had once felt like refuge. It still did. The girl they called Dudley learned how to stand upright in rooms that tried to fold her in half. She learned how to read receipts. She learned that names can be reclaimed. If someone once handed you a word and told you it was your identity, I hope you choose your own now. Tell me in the comments what they called you and what you call yourself instead. And if this story felt like something you needed to hear, stay. There are more quiet stories like this one